Hello there, friend. Welcome back to a Level Deeper podcast, or maybe for the first time. And let's just take a moment, if you haven't, to applaud yourself and be proud of yourself. Whether you clicked or swiped or tapped or whoever you got here, you have decided to enter into a conversation with me and my guests. You decided to click on a show called A Level Deeper, and with that comes the expectation that there's probably going to be some conversation here that's going to cause you to think, to reflect, to maybe approach your life a little bit differently, and maybe hear someone else's story that might shift some of your thinking and some of your approach to your own story. And I think that's honorable. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to invest into this time with me and my guest today, who happens to be a gentleman named Eric Pothen. You know, I'll tell you, we talk about it later in the show, but I met Eric through my wife, Eileen. And essentially, I went to Eileen a week or two ago and said, I need to have more dudes on my show. I need to interview more men. Not that the show has to be all about connecting with other men. What I was finding was that a lot of the topics that we talk about on the show, this concept of a level deeper, seem to really appeal to a female audience. And I just wasn't getting the same sort of response from the male audience. And I've had a lot of women come to me and say, hey, I'd love to be on the show, or this would be a great guest for the show. And I have not had the same experience for men. So it was really meaningful today to be able to connect with someone like Eric. And I've got to tell you, I would just simply describe Eric as a person of courage, immense courage. Eric has made a lot of decisions in his life to embrace himself fully. And I think at the human level, I think we all aspire to that, don't we? We want to embrace ourselves. We want to authentically showcase who we are and all that comes with that choice. You're going to hear that today in so many ways from Eric in parts of this conversation, as Eric shares some of his story that involves embracing his sexuality, embracing his eating disorder history, embracing his experience with an eating disorder, embracing a new career path that he chose to take in his life. He's made a lot of these decisions to embrace these elements and these parts of himself that I think, from my perspective, have taken a lot of courage. And we talk about what that experience has been like to embrace these different parts of himself, and how it's kind of a multi-layered journey of first embracing yourself and embracing these parts within yourself, and then ultimately coming to the decision to outwardly portray these parts of yourself and embrace it externally as well. Eric talks us through what that process was like for him in these different areas of his life. And I just found it really enlightening and empowering to hear someone share these elements of their journey. And I took something away from it. And I think you're going to take many things away from Eric's story and perspectives as well. This is another really special conversation on this little podcast we like to call A Level Deeper. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic back to Past Chad, who recorded this conversation with Eric Pothen. I was live sitting in my van somewhere in the Brighton, Michigan area. And so, yeah, I hope that you enjoy my conversation with Eric. Here it is. What is the experience like? You host your own show. It's called Embracing You. And as you sit on the interviewee side of things, how does that feel? How is that experience different than hosting the conversation for you?
Yeah, to be honest, it's a lot less stressful. I think for me, I am known to be very type A. And so I think when I sit down to have conversations with other podcasters and to be the interviewee, it allows me to honestly trust myself a little bit more. And I find myself less in my head the more I do these. And I think it allows for, my own true authentic voice to come out because, I don't really prepare. I really just lean into trusting that my intuition, my inner voice will guide me throughout these conversations. And so while I love interviewing others, I think it is also, I'm very honored to be able to be in this position to be interviewed, because I know how therapeutic it can be for others to be able to have the space to share their voice in their story. And there's also healing involved for me whenever I have the opportunity to come on and to share my voice and my story as well.
That's I like that perspective. I've found through different modalities, whether that be coaching, whether that be therapy, coming on a podcast, there's something very different. I consider myself to be a very reflective person. I spend a lot of time thinking about my life. Sometimes that feels really good. Sometimes that feels really not good. And it leads me down some interesting places. But there's something very different in investing time just thinking about our lives, thinking about ourselves, thinking about our stories, and actually verbalizing and talking about them, processing them. You mentioned the word, there's something therapeutic about it. I mean, that's been my experience as well. When you're sharing some of your perspective or some of your story, there can be something that's a little bit of a release as you're actually verbalizing what those things are, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm such a strong proponent of that as well. And I'm a verbal processor by nature. And so I think for me to be able to put thoughts that are running up into my mind into words allows for that release, because I feel like for so many humans, thoughts can just linger and linger and linger, and they don't have the opportunity to fully express them in whatever way that might be. And so I think for me to be able to verbally process and to have conversations with one another, that's why it's therapeutic. And I feel like that's why there's that release.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's been my experience as well. As I was listening to a couple episodes of your show, there was, typically as longtime listeners of this show will know, I talk about my preparation process, and that preparation process for an interview is usually like, I don't know, I'm going to go look on your social media. I might listen to a couple things. I'm looking for something I can just sort of grab onto that I think will, as you and I were just talking about before we started recording, when you enter into these conversations, you're looking for maybe one thread you can kind of pull on to start the conversation and then see where it goes from there. In your intro to your show, as you describe what the show is about, there's one line in particular where you say, the goal of the show is to help people, or to honor and embrace yourself so you can live your most authentic life. What a beautiful statement that is. What a beautiful goal and intention of your show, embracing you. Tell me a little bit of the story behind that phrase. That feels like one of those sentences that has a story behind it. I find myself as a creator, I put things out into the world often that are reflections of my own story, my own experiences. Helping people honor and embrace yourself so you can live your most authentic life. Tell us about what's behind that statement.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting to hear that sentence read out loud and to myself. It very much so represents, I feel like, a large part of this life journey that I've been on. And a lot of what inspired me to jump into this space of starting a podcast, doing more advocacy work around eating disorders and body image. And, when I think of that sentence, to honor and embrace yourself, a lot of what that looked like for me was honoring and embracing my story. There are a couple of parts of my own life story that I have felt a lot of shame and guilt around, especially more specifically, my story of, me growing into my sexuality, and then B, my story of living with an eating disorder. And those two parts of my story, like I just mentioned, I carried a lot of shame and guilt around. But in a lot of this personal work I've been doing, I've really been leaning into honoring and embracing that part of my story instead of feeling the shame and guilt associated with it. And by sending these parts of my story love, and by not casting any judgment for these parts of my stories, I've learned that there has been such a release in the way that I carry myself today. And I find that being proud of these parts of my story and leaning into these parts of my identity has really allowed me to be my authentic self. And so I think with my podcast, I am just really hoping that listeners can hear some part of their story in an episode, recognize it's okay to feel shame and guilt, but we cannot let shame and guilt affect the way that we carry ourselves forward today. And rather, when we can learn to embrace it, that's when that true authenticity comes out, because there is no shame and guilt occupying our mind, and we're able to truly live life according to our heart.
Shame and guilt are two powerful words, carry a lot of meaning behind them. For you, as you reflect on these parts of your story, why were shame and guilt the things that came to mind, or what what was it that you were feeling the shame and guilt about as it relates to your own story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with my eating disorder, I think to be a male and to have struggled with an eating disorder, there is a lot of stigma around it. And when I was actually in the depths of struggling with my eating disorder, I never once considered myself to have an eating disorder. And so I didn't recognize that that's what it was until I was entering into the space of recovery. And so I think there was some shame and guilt to fully acknowledge that that is what I was living with for the 3.5 years that I had my eating disorder. So I think there was some level of humility there, where I had friends and family come to me during this time that I was struggling and say, "We are concerned about you. Are you okay?" And to just play it off as, yeah, everything is fine. And so I think there was that element there too, of recognizing that I was not being honest with them. And so there was some shame and guilt associated with that. And then with regards to my sexuality, when I first had come to, I don't like to use the word accept, but rather I'm going to use the word embrace, right? So when I first learned to embrace my sexuality, I was not comfortable with it at all. I just wished that I was straight, and I wanted to just suppress every single part of myself. And so I think, even in the beginning stages of me growing into and starting to embrace my sexuality, there was, I should really say, that fear of judgment and from others when I chose to come out. And there was that fear of, losing friendships, losing family members, all because of, the fear of how homosexuals are viewed in today's society. And I think moving out of that space and into a space where I've really learned to embrace and actually love who I am and what my sexuality is, it's required a lot of work. And I look back at all of these years that I had suppressed who I was as an individual, and it makes me feel very sad that I didn't allow myself to be who I knew myself to be at such a young age. I knew when I was in middle school that this is what I was, this is what my sexuality was. But there was just so much shame and fear and guilt associated with being a gay man, and what that would come with, and what others would say about, me coming out and what my sexuality is.
You intentionally stopped yourself when you said you don't like the word accept, and you prefer the word embrace. Can you share what those two words mean to you?
Yeah, the reason why I chose to change my word with accept, for me, that feels like it has a negative connotation to it, where, oh, I'm just accepting this, right? Where it's like a negative. There's that negative association with it. I think the word embrace means I'm honoring it and loving it at the same time, right? I'm not trying to change it. I'm not having any negative attitude towards it. Rather, I am choosing to allow what was in existence to be, and to really just give it a big hug. Like embrace, like that is such a powerful word, where, when I using that with regards to my sexuality, like that really hit deep within as I said that out loud too, because that's constant work I'm doing on myself, is learning to lean into that part and honor and love that part of myself, because I know that's a large part of what makes me me. And while it's not my sole identity, I honor and embrace that it is a part of my identity as well.
I mean, I'm a believer that words are powerful. You know, I like how you have put a lot of intentionality behind the word choices that you use. As I hear you explain that, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that that's a really beautiful reframe or shift in the verbiage that you use, because isn't that what we all ultimately want, is to be able to just embrace all parts of ourselves? And I think when we can do that, when we can show up more as our, what feels like our true authentic selves, I think we can all understand that feeling. We don't want to accept it because it's something that's just like, well, it's just what it is, so we have to accept it. We want to truly embrace it, embody it, live it out. I really love that you have adopted that word embrace. I think that's really powerful.
Thanks. Yeah. And, I think everyone deserves to embrace who they are. I feel like not everyone, but there are a lot of people in this world that kind of just live life behind the veil, right? Where they know who they are within, but they adapt themselves to make themselves more likable. They adapt themselves to, be portrayed differently by others. And, I really believe that this world can be a much more beautiful place if people just leaned into honoring who they were and loving those parts of themselves and recognizing too that, hey, I have my own flaws. That's okay. Like that, we are human. And I think that's just part of human nature, is that we can't be this perfect robot going about each and every day that we live on this planet. Rather, there is space to be human. There is space to be yourself. And one thing that I've learned in my own journey too is I find myself being surrounded by the type of people that I want to be surrounded with now that I've really leaned into my true authentic self. And life is just so much better when you have those people around you that match your energy and that can encourage you and motivate you and add just so much joy into your life, where I just wish everyone felt good about who they are as a person and recognize that you are you, and that makes you unique. And I love that you have these characteristics about you that I might not necessarily have, because that gives me an opportunity to learn more about you and how you operate. And that might challenge the way I view and think about the world as well.
I think that's why I love the thesis of this podcast, is just sharing people's stories and sharing our stories. I think that, like you said, people can maybe find elements of themselves in someone else's story, or they can hear something that might encourage them to more fully embrace themselves. As we look at your story, you've made a couple that we've talked about in this conversation, I'm sure many more, but a couple very courageous choices, particularly the choice of choosing to embrace yourself and to present and say, I'm Eric, and this is my story, and this is my experience. You talked about related to your sexuality. You talked about related to your eating disorder. I want to understand, to me, there's maybe two parts of this. So I've got to imagine, before you can make the choice to present yourself to other people and say, you know what, this is who I am. This is what I've been through. This is my story. I've got to imagine it's got to start as an internal process where first you've maybe got to embrace these parts of yourself. Can we start there? Because it seems like these two journeys that we've talked about, I've got to imagine have some similar elements to them. What was the process like to internally start to embrace yourself and these parts of yourself that maybe you had struggled with?
I think one of the biggest things that happened internally for me was that I recognized that like so much of my own internal headspace and my own internal dialogue revolved around these two parts of my story. And it really took away from my ability to fully be present in this world, I think. And so, because these things have been or had been weighing on me for so long, I knew that it was time to just release. And it's scary. It was a very scary thing to even think about, right? I think very much like you said, this is multifaceted in which the first step is really to embrace and recognize that, like, wow, these are parts of my identity. These are parts of my story, and I'm ready to share that with the world. There's a lot of fear attached with that, right? Because you don't know how people are going to respond. But, I feel like this was also the catalyst for me to begin to honor and embrace my own needs, and for once not putting the needs of others in front of my own, and the comfort, and to have that sense of comfort for others, right? Like, I feel like I had always prioritized that, and I still do, but it's in a much more balanced way today. But rather, I knew that this would meet my own needs. And I've ultimately learned that, like, it is important for me, Eric, to be able to meet my own needs and to not necessarily depend on others. Because I think when we learn to recognize that we can provide ourselves what we need and trust ourselves that we can do that, we're able to move so much more freely in this world and really lean into our true authentic selves as well. So I know I'm kind of getting away from the essence of your initial question here, but I really think it comes back to needing to release all of the noise that was coming into my brain and recognizing that this was a need of mine. In the moment, I needed to release this.
That idea of meeting our own needs first is something that I struggle with a lot. I tend to want to meet the needs of other people, and then it's like, well, if there's time or energy left to meet some of my own needs, then I'll try to do that. And inevitably, what ends up happening over and over and over again is that I try to meet the needs of everyone else. I try to make them happy, and there is no energy left. There is no, I don't have anything else to try to meet some of my own needs. So I can really resonate as you describe it that way. And I think a lot of us can resonate with that feeling of putting ourselves last. And yet, what a powerful shift it is when we recognize our own needs first, and then we can show up differently for other people.
Mm-hmm. And, as you were talking, there was one word that came to my mind that I think has really been critical for me to be able to enter into the space of honoring my own needs. And the word that came to mind was honesty. I feel like there has been a large part of my life where I am not fully honest with other individuals, where I feel like in order to provide them the comfort that they need, that I need to twist my words and not fully be honest with what I feel like I actually need to say and communicate with others. And I've really leaned into, where I have found the most release in my life is when I have given myself the space to use my voice and be honest with other people. Because I've learned that if I'm not able to be fully honest with another individual, I'm not being my authentic self. They're not seeing the true me. And what I've learned actually is people appreciate this newly found, more honest version of myself because I'm able to fully express and release after I say whatever it is that I'm going to say. Because so often when we filter ourselves, we can ruminate on the past and, oh, I wish I would have said this. And, because I feel like sometimes we fluff it up, right? We fluff up honest conversations that need to be had. And we carry those lingering thoughts with us. But in my own journey, I have found that when we release and say what we need to say, we're able to move on with our lives and move on with our days and not dwell and ruminate on, oh, I wish I would have said this. And that just makes navigating your day-to-day life a little easier.
how has it felt to start being honest, and how have other people received you? You know, you talked about we've talked about these two stories, especially with your eating disorder, your sexuality, being honest about those things to other people around you. It sounds like that's just kind of been a theme in your life in general. That's been a theme in my life recently too, trying to be more honest, speak my truth. What has your experience been as you start to be more honest and you start to embrace yourself and you start to speak that into the world, into people? You mentioned fear. There's a lot of fear around being honest. What has been your actual experience around this process of starting to approach your life with honesty?
I think I'm really starting to find my voice. I really think that's what it all comes down to, where I feel like so much of my own life, I've silenced myself in a way, because life has always been about others for me, and it still is. But I've also learned that I need to be able to live life for myself as well and not be as self-sacrificial as I was in the past. And I've found that by balancing that out, I'm showing up more authentically, right? Where you often hear this phrase, you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. And that's really hard to do. It feels very selfish, to be honest, to take care of yourself first. And also, I think that's where there's work to be done in today's society to get out of that negative notion that taking care of yourself is not selfish. It is such an important part of life that we all need to be able to do. And once again, the two words that come to mind are shame and guilt, right? Because we're choosing to invest time and energy into ourselves over others. And for giving people, that is really hard to do. And I still feel some guilt around, taking time for myself and recharging and saying no to obligations, or when people ask me to go out. But I've really found that with honesty, with this self-care, I just move about life thinking less and less and overthinking things. I am really choosing to lean into trusting my intuition more. And with that is trusting that voice within and trusting what your heart is communicating to you. And that's hard. It is really hard.
Yes, it is.
Especially when, your heart is communicating something to you that might result in conflict or might result in another person's feelings being hurt, right? Like, that's really hard and a scary thing to do. But it takes practice. It takes practice. And, I think once we learn to respond from this space, and once you said too at the very beginning, it's like pulling the initial thread, right? So I think being honest and communicating fully is pulling that thread and trusting in what is going to follow and trusting your own skills and abilities to maneuver and navigate whatever it is that happens.
Yeah, because it's like that idea when we approach situations with honesty, we make it okay, or we create a space where people can reciprocate that back to us, right? Where if I'm honest, it empowers someone else to live into and to embrace themselves. That's why I think the way that I see you showing up and sharing on your podcast, on your social media, that comes through a lot. That word honesty, as I'm hearing you now explain some of these intentional maybe shifts that you've made in your life, I wanted to share with you as a onlooker to your story and your journey. I think that really comes through. I see someone who is embracing themselves, is as you said, it's a constant journey, right? It's not something that all of a sudden we just snap our fingers one day and, I embrace myself. Okay, this is easy. And now this is going to be forever simple, and I never have to think about this again. But I really applaud you for the way in which you communicate and present yourself. And I think it is sort of that beacon that allows and inspires other people to do the same. So I wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to. You mentioned the stigma, especially with men, around eating disorders. I have familiarity with eating disorders. My wife was just on your podcast, and that episode will be out at some point. So her story is not my story to tell. So if you want to go hear my wife Eileen's story, go check out Eric's podcast, because she had a conversation with Eric and she'll share more of that. Her story is not mine to tell, but she has struggled with some of the things that you've talked about. And so I've kind of had that front row view of understanding some of how eating disorders can affect people, how they show up in people's lives, and how that recovery process can go. My perception is that it seems like it's something that's often talked about in the female community. It doesn't seem like it's something that I often hear about or is often talked about in the male community. What is your perspective, and why do you think that this stigma exists in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, to start this off, actually, 1 in 4 of those that struggle with an eating let me restart that. Of those that struggle with an eating disorder, 1 in 4 are male. So it's 25%. And once again, these are reported statistics. And so this doesn't account for all of the men that struggle behind closed doors like I did. So when I was struggling with my eating disorder, I was not a part of that statistic. And I can guarantee you there are a lot of other men out there that may have an eating disorder, that may struggle with food, with body image, with body dysmorphia. And once again, I really think there's such stigma around it, because when you think of eating disorder, the first words that come to mind are white female. And so there's just this already preconceived notion of what an eating disorder looks like. I think with that, there's so much work to be done in that space, not only with regards to gender, right? So any gender can struggle with an eating disorder, but also the body types, where a large percentage of those that actually struggle with an eating disorder aren't underweight. They're at what people would consider a normal, healthy weight, air quotes. And so I think for me and my story, I didn't fall into that category of being a normal weight. And I fit the picture of, when you think of eating disorder, very underweight, malnourished, engaging a lot of unhealthy behaviors, over exercise, restriction. And, I think people didn't know necessarily, and this is just in general too, how to have a conversation to bring it up, right? Where I feel like just because I was a male and struggling, they didn't want to necessarily label me as having an eating disorder, because they aren't associated with it. Men aren't associated with having eating disorders. And so I think that played a large role. But I think there is just this fear, especially when we think about masculinity in today's society, where I feel like there is a lot of fear from men of being perceived as having feminine, quote unquote, feminine qualities, such as showing emotion, such as the way that they dress and present themselves, such as the tone of their voice. And then we get to such as struggling with things that are typically associated with women, and that being an eating disorder. And so I really think that's probably at the root of why a lot of men might feel some shame and guilt around struggling with something, is that because it questions their masculinity.
So working through some of your story and experience, how did you go from the process of maybe, I don't know, first noticing that something about your habits around eating or your habits around food were something about them maybe what was off, to embracing and accepting and starting to use some of the terminology of eating disorder and embracing some of that? What does that process look like?
Yeah, I feel like my story. And once again, everyone's stories are very different from one another. But, I did not receive any sort of formal treatment for my eating disorder. So I really entered into the space of recovery all on my own. And what kind of led me to that tipping point of, wanting to enter into that space was just this constant state of feeling like I was living life in a haze, and each day would go by and I would get to the end of it and I wouldn't know fully what happened. And I think back to those 3.5 years that I struggled, and I don't remember anything really from those years, which is quite scary to think about because those were formative years of my life where I, got my first job, where, I'm at all of these things. And it's just so scary for me to think and reflect on that, where yeah, I just am at a loss for words thinking about that part of my life. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I just kind of hit a little bit of an emotional wall right there thinking about that.
Well, it's also, I think a powerful sort of description of, because my wife Eileen will share many of those same things, where she can look back at periods of her life and maybe not have that many memories because there was so much focus on body and food and constantly thinking about these things and ruminating about these things. It almost doesn't allow for other experiences and thoughts and memories to come into your life, right? And it's so consuming. So it sounds like that was maybe part of first recognizing that, okay, maybe there's something more going on here, something that I need to address. Then how does the recovery stage happen?
Yeah. So kind of going back to my story where I had recognized that I was living life in such a blur, and I was tired of feeling like I was living in that haze where I knew I needed to do something about it. My parents and my family was to the point where they had said to me, if you aren't going to gain weight, we're going to schedule a doctor's appointment for you. And I was like, no, you're not. And so because I knew that if I were to go into the doctors, that they would probably diagnose me as having an eating disorder, and then I would go into treatment, and that would mean gaining weight, which was the last thing that I wanted to do. And so I knew I didn't want to put myself into that setting, which, hearing me say that now in the space that I am now in my own recovery, I just go back to thinking like, what could life look like for me today had I gotten the official support and the true support that I probably needed in the time? And, I can spend hours and hours thinking about that, but I just find myself curious, and there's no judgment, I think, with the route that I chose to take. But I always just find myself curious and thinking about the beginning stages of my recovery, where I would be today.
Is there anything that you think would be different?
I think just the tools that I currently have in my toolbox, I think it could be diversified. And, I think when you enter into the space of, receiving formalized treatment, you're in an environment in which you are constantly being asked to challenge that eating disorder voice. And you are in a setting where you are learning to release control from the eating disorder voice in a more condensed, controlled setting. And not being in that space, I feel like, it was hard to know how to navigate it on my own, and to not necessarily know, how do I learn to have conversations with this eating disorder voice of mine when I'm in this space of recovery, and when it's trying to convince me to not eat a meal, when it's trying to convince me to skip a meal. And how do I learn to have a conversation with it and then move forward in a way that will still serve me? And so I think, having that formalized system of support, I think would have better equipped me in my earlier stages of recovery, to just move with it a little bit easier. But once again, I feel very grateful for my own mental strength to navigate it somewhat on my own. I didn't necessarily talk to a lot of people and tell people I was entering into the space of recovery, and just learning to find a way that recovery would seem possible and doable for me.
I come back to this idea that words matter. It stood out to me that you said the eating disorder voice, and listening to that eating disorder voice. It sort of personifies the eating disorder as something else, right? It's not, the eating disorder is not the same as Eric. It's not the same as you. It is this voice that exists, and it speaks to you and it says things, but it's separate from you. Is that kind of what's behind labeling it that way?
Yes, 100%. And I think that's one of the biggest learning curves I think there is to first entering into that space of recovery. Because when you live with an eating disorder, you lose yourself, you lose your identity, and that eating disorder takes over your mind, it takes over your body. And entering into the space of recovery means pausing and zooming out and recognizing that there is still a person in this body, there is still a voice inside this body, apart from this eating disorder that has been living in our bodies for however long it is. With that awareness, I believe you're able to zoom out and begin to make those intentional changes with the way that you are going about your relationship with food, with exercise, with your body, the way that you are engaging in dialogue, and the way that you are talking about your body, right? And I think once you can begin to learn and recognize that when you are feeling some sort of distress, it is probably a result of that eating disorder voice telling you something. And once you're able to differentiate that, oh, this is my eating disorder voice talking, this is not my voice, then you can challenge it. But it's that integral part of being able to distinguish and recognize when that voice is active and it is that voice versus what is your own voice.
I've got to imagine that's a nuanced and difficult in the beginning. It's difficult to separate the two.
It is. It's very hard. And, I really believe recovery is an ongoing process. And there are still moments where my eating disorder voice tries to sneak back into the picture. And, I think what I feel most proud of, and I think really what sets you apart from being in recovery, is your ability to maneuver those moments when the eating disorder voice becomes active and tries to tempt you and move you back into, maybe some disordered eating habits, and to say, I hear you, but I'm also not going to listen to you, and I'm going to choose to respond differently. It's those moments of success that really continue to help move you forward in your recovery. But what I also don't want listeners to hear is that if you choose to listen to the eating disorder voice, if you are in recovery and that voice becomes active, that doesn't make you a failure. Because there are moments where you might have those setbacks, where you feel like you have engaged in a behavior that the old past version of you might have engaged in. But you have that awareness. You recognize that, hey, I might have done this, and I can take that as knowledge in the future when something like that comes up again. And in one of my interviews, a guest had said, it's often the things that set us back that help us grow and move forward the most. And I think that is so true with everything in life.
Unfortunately, I continue to find that as well. I say unfortunately in that, those setbacks bring a lot of pain, a lot of frustration, a lot of difficult feelings and emotions with them. And yet it does seem like consistently they lead us to become better versions of ourselves. They lead us to better places. And like you said, we learn a lot from those experiences. So I've definitely found that to be the case. Do you have thoughts or perspective on going back to this topic of men in particular? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on how we go about creating an environment where men can have conversations about topics like disordered eating and eating disorders, and how these can become more sort of accepted topics that as men are getting together, we're talking about XYZ topics. Eating disorders is not often going to be one that's going to be in those topics of conversation. How do we make it more part of the male culture and more accepted?
That's a great question. And I often find myself asking myself that question quite often, as I feel like the answer to that question really is integral in the work that I do as an eating disorder advocate. And, I really think, of course, that's a really beautiful place to want to end up. But I really think to start this movement off to making it more normalized, we need more people sharing their story. We need more people openly talking to other people, more particularly men, right? Talking with other men, women too, that's fine, whomever. But I think men need to just know that they are safe enough to share these parts of their story with other men, with other individuals. I think that safety component can be at the core of why a lot of men might not talk about it. And it goes back to that fear of judgment. And I think another thing that we can do is begin to shift the language that we use and to really begin to question a lot of these gender norms that I feel like have been deeply ingrained within our society when it comes to what it means to be a man, right? To be emotionally blank, to not be in touch with emotions, to not be able to express emotions, to, have it seem like you have your life together, like you have to be the rock for everyone, the rock for the family, the caretaker, the provider. Like all of these things leave no room for men to be human. And I think that is frustrating, right? Where, of course, all people deserve to be human, right? And they deserve to live life according to them and outside of whatever roles gender, plays in their life. But more particularly to men, there just needs to be a wider acceptance, I think, of men choosing to share their story and not casting judgment. I think judgment is a large part, too, of what can put men back into the closet, if you will, to keep their problems to themselves. So I think it's multifaceted, in which if men do choose to share, we need to listen without judgment and honor and thank them for sharing their part of themselves, so they then feel more empowered to go and have another conversation with another individual. But then also, just challenging gender norms. That's really what it comes down to. And it takes courage, and it's scary. It is scary to be a man and to come out with sharing my eating disorder. I had no clue how that was going to be perceived. And so it takes a leap of faith, but also I know the power of what it can be like for a man to hear another man share a struggle with something that they are struggling with, and to know that they aren't alone and that it's okay if they are.
That was a great answer to a very complex question. Just boiling it down to sharing stories. And you're right. I think on the receiving end of someone sharing their story as a listener, like I am to your story in this moment, I appreciate that you brought attention to recognizing and thanking someone for sharing their story and for being willing to engage in a conversation like this. And so, to try to be a good listener, I'll say that to you now. I appreciate that you are willing to share this story with me and with the people who are going to hear this conversation. And I applaud you for that. I really admire you for it, because you're choosing to embrace these parts of yourself, and not just embrace them internally, but you're externally embracing them as well. And you're advocating for other people. And I think, as I said to you earlier in the conversation, in doing that, it's a really powerful example. You are showing other men what it looks like to embrace these parts of themselves, and you're kind of providing this pathway that other people could follow and say, you know what, I'm actually feeling some of those same things. So thank you for being who you are and for sharing your story, because it is setting that example. You have your own story, and not there's anything wrong with people who don't decide to go communicate externally about their own stories and experiences. But you have chosen to also become a coach and also be someone who helps other people navigate some of the things that you have navigated in your life. What was it that led you down that path?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's something that I keep returning back to, because I think it's important for me to continuously reflect on why I do the work that I do and how I got into this space. And, what I really think led me to wanting to dive deeper and help others and be an advocate and be a coach is that I knew the power, or I understood the power of what it can look like to honor a part of your story, right? So for me, it was my eating disorder, and to hold space for another individual. That is just something that is so incredibly important to me in the work that I do, is just being able to provide and create a non-judgmental space for people to come to as they are, and to be seen as a human, and to be seen as someone outside of their current struggles, and to recognize that beyond these things, like such as living with an eating disorder, there are so many other beautiful qualities within these other individuals that need to also get love and attention. And so I think once I started doing my advocacy work, it just became very clear that I was passionate about raising awareness and helping others. And so I didn't go to school to become a eating disorder therapist or an eating disorder recovery coach. My undergrad is in music education. And so I left teaching after 7 years, simply because I felt like life was calling me elsewhere. And so it took a big leap of faith on my own part to choose to say goodbye to something that was a large part of my identity for 7 years, and to really begin to honor this new calling of mine, which I really do believe is entering into this space of eating disorder advocacy, helping those that struggle with an eating disorder rediscover their true self, and to embrace all parts of themselves that, really has become my new North Star in life. And, I've been toying around the idea of going back to school within the next couple of years and getting a counseling degree and putting myself in a therapeutic setting to help those that are struggling with an eating disorder, because people deserve recovery. People deserve to have the support they need to overcome something like an eating disorder. And to me, it feels really special to be able to use my own life struggles as my message and my why behind why I do what I do.
Like, a lot of times those are the most powerful foundations to to creating or doing what we decide to do in life, is our own story, is our own experiences, and those that provides a really powerful fire within us. I just learned of as you shared that, I just learned of another courageous decision that you've made in your life to leave a 7-year teaching career and go pursue a different kind of work. I mean, I'm seeing a pattern here of a lot of courageous decisions that you've made. And it sounds like a lot of these have been maybe within the last chapter or the last 5-year chapter of your life. That's a talk about embracing you, embracing yourself. That's a lot of powerful decisions that you've been making.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And, I feel like other people have told me that, and I internalize it, and I process it. And yes, I recognize that these have been very big and courageous steps that I've taken. But I feel like in my life, I've always been that person to just take another step, right? And just move with it. And, I think other people are like, oh my gosh, that was such a big thing that you did. But like internally, I'm like, is it really? I just felt like I was doing something that I knew I needed to do. And I guess I haven't really known much else in my life, because I feel like I've just been the type of person to put my head down and do what I need to do in order to get myself to the place that I want to be. And it's hard. It's hard work. But I think once you take that step or jump or leap, whatever it is that you want to call it, that's a majority of the battle, right? Is trusting yourself enough that this decision is what is best for you. Once you can get over that and enter into the space, I truly believe the rest will unfold the way it's meant to unfold. And that's hard to do as well.
Well, so maybe that's just a reflection of you said it just felt like you were doing what you needed to do. And so maybe even for me, maybe viewing these as big, courageous decisions is a reflection of the difficult relationship that many of us have with our own intuition and with feeling like we know what we need to do and having a difficult time acting on it and doing it. And so maybe that's why these feel like big things. And you might be able to look and say, I don't know, it wasn't really that big. It just was one step. It's also a great reminder that in any big decision that we're going to make, it does have to just start with one single step, one single decision, one small thing that leads to a big change. And so maybe most of all, it's that you do seem very in touch with your intuition, with that inner sense of knowing that pulls you certain directions and says, you know what, I think this is what I need to do. And you're just like, okay, yeah, I guess that's what I'm going to go do.
Yeah, it really comes down to honoring. Once again, it's just like honoring what your heart is communicating to you and trusting in that. Like that has been such a key part of the personal work I've been doing on myself, is leaning into that inner voice that I know I have and acting on it. And with something such as a career change, like, yes, a career change is a big deal. Like I don't want to say that choosing to leave a career isn't a small choice that anyone has to make in life. But I also truly believe that because a lot of people might not act on certain things like this, whatever problem or thing it is gets a lot bigger than what it needs to be, because those thoughts just continue to ruminate and get bigger in the mind. And after it's like the snowball effect, right? Of like a snowball going down the mountain and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Where if you can learn to address something when it's that small, compact snowball, that's going to be so much easier moving with that than trying to move with this huge snowball that's built up because you haven't taken action and aren't addressing this inner narrative that's going on. And so I think for me, and some of the work that I do with my clients too, a lot of the work is going back to trusting that intuition. And what does that look like? It doesn't have to be something as big as spontaneously or compulsively choosing to leave your job. It can look something as simple as, oh, I feel like I should wear a sweater today, and just putting on a sweater, even though you might not know if you want to wear it or not, right? It is going down the stairs and thinking about, what do I want to have for breakfast? I want to have a piece of toast. Okay, make yourself the piece of toast. Like, all of these things are trusting your intuition and leaning into that inner voice of yours. And so I think how I've been talking about trusting my intuition has been on a larger scale, right? But I also want people to know that trusting your intuition can be something as simple as doing some of those things that I just mentioned.
As you think about the future for you, you've got a podcast, you are getting into some of this coaching work, you're thinking about maybe going back to school. I don't know, is there sort of a big scary vision for Eric's life that you ruminate on and that you think about, this is kind of where maybe I'd like to be or like to get to someday? Is there something for you?
Yeah. The more I continue to just put it out there and be vocal with other people that I might go back to school, the more I realize that, like, that is going to happen. Like, I just know, I know. It's becoming very clear within that this is the path I'm supposed to be on. My biggest fear, honestly, is finances. I am still paying off my undergraduate degree. I am paying off my first master's degree that I got in music education. To think about the financial burden to go back to school scares me, right? Of how am I going to be able to pay off this future schooling of mine when money right now is not in abundance for me in my life? So that is definitely a barrier that I'm kind of maneuvering within. And this really comes back down and back to me trusting the process, right? Where I know me taking this leap of faith and going back to school, I have to trust that how it unfolds will put me in a place that I will be able to provide for myself. And that's really scary. But also, I need to lean into the discomfort that comes with it and embrace it, right? There's that word again of leaning into the fact that I might not have the answers. I can have an idea of where I want to go, but I am not in control of how it's going to unfold every step of the way. And so it's releasing the need to control every step of the way and just allowing yourself to be immersed in the journey and experience.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that and kind of putting it out. I think there is something to just letting some of that go and putting some of that out into the universe and saying, you know what, this is what I want to achieve. This is what I'm looking to do. These are some of my barriers. And I don't know. I as one of my former guests, Nick Mundy, said, the universe just has a way of balling out. And sometimes the universe is just going to show up and it's going to do some things that you just never expected. So I appreciate you being willing to share some of what your vision is. And I have a difficult time doing that, but I seem to keep finding that sometimes that's just the first step is being able to state, this is what I want. And maybe even state, this is what's in my way, and let the universe just ball out.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, like, I want people to know that I'm a human as well. And just because I am on here sharing my life's experiences and what I've learned and how it's helped me to get me where I am today, that's not to say I don't struggle and make mistakes on a daily basis, because I do. I mess up some days. I fall back down. I, might not carry myself the way that I want to carry myself in any given day. And that's just part of me being human. And I think I just wanted to throw that out there as well, because I want listeners to know that behind their microphone is a living human being who doesn't have all of their shit put together.
Well, that makes two of us in this conversation. So yeah, I think it's just a great message and reminder to anyone who listens. I think it can be easy to share some of our stories, some of our perspectives, and the things that we're reflecting on, and the things that we're figuring out, and the things that we want to continue. As we've talked about often in this conversation, it's the forever journey of learning about ourselves, of recovering, of healing, of trying to trust our intuition. It's a forever process, and so I appreciate you saying that. I resonate with that. I am certainly a very imperfect example of trying to navigate this life, but I think it becomes a little easier when we can all recognize that and do it together. So as we wrap up our conversation, I just again want to say thank you for, I recognize that stepping into the space of this podcast is a vulnerable one. It's an unknown space. I create a very blank canvas and we paint something together on it, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. And I applaud you and appreciate you for stepping into this space with me. I thank you for sharing your story. And as you've alluded to in this conversation, that is step number one. And so by you doing that, my hope and I trust in the fact that will inspire and allow other people to do the same. So thank you for stepping into this space with me. If people wanted to find you, if they wanted to find the work that you're doing, if they wanted to find your podcast, how can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, I just want to thank you as well for creating this space, not only for myself, but for all of your guests, because it is a much needed space. And I feel like so many people don't have the opportunity to step into spaces and to be listened to and to be heard. And so I just want to thank you for your work in creating these spaces for others to come onto as well. And, to also be a male and to be having a conversation with another male, I think is incredibly powerful. And, if going back to an earlier part of our conversation, this is the type of conversation that begins to open the door for other men, right? Where you
That's
have
right.
two men talking about things like mental health, like sexuality, all of these things, right? And recognizing, hey, there's two men having a conversation. What might that look like for me?
Well, I'll share with you quickly, this conversation, you and I having this conversation primarily came about because a week or so ago, I was sitting down with my wife and I was like, I need more men on the show. When I first started the show, I just went to some of my kind of, immediate friend group and people that I thought might be good guests. And it was actually pretty male dominant. And then as the show went along, I have a primarily female listenership, and the people who respond to the kinds of conversations that we're having tends to be more female because, as we've talked about, they're very emotionally driven conversations. There's a lot of vulnerability. There's a lot of discomfort. We're really digging into the human experience. And it's just been interesting to notice that seems to really land with a female audience. And I was just I've been having this pull of, I'm like, where are all the guys that are willing to engage in a conversation like this? And so I was talking with Eileen about that, and I was like, I need your help brainstorming, who are some guys that will come join me in this space? Because I'm finding it difficult to find them. So that's how this conversation came to be. And I'm glad. I mean, it's part of why I wanted to start the show is I'm like, hey, I go through life as a very emotional guy. I love that about myself. It's taken a lot of work to embrace that about myself, but I think it is part of what makes me special. And I want to engage with other men because I think that there are conversations that we as men need to demonstrate having so that we can make it part of what is just sort of acceptable conversation for men to have and for us to talk about. So anyway, that's really kind of how this conversation came about. And so I'll probably ask you, who are other men that you know that I could be having a conversation with? Because I think it's just really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one thing before I can go back to where people can find me too, but, there was some fear during this conversation that I had to maneuver as well of, being a gay man talking to a heterosexual male, right? So there was like that own inner conflict and fear that I was working with as we were having this conversation too. And I think, it's important to name that with regards to vulnerability as well, where vulnerability can be scary and it's okay for it to be scary. But once again, lean into that discomfort because you don't know where it's going to lead. And so I just really want to commend you for the work that you're doing. And I'm really excited to see what other men you bring on to this podcast as well, to have these deeper level conversations to really begin to open up the door for other men. But where people can find me, I'm still in the process of getting my website up and running. But right now, my podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and it's called Embracing You. And then my Instagram page is at @Pothen. That is EPOTHEN. And on there, I post a lot of mental health awareness, eating disorder awareness, body image, anti-diet culture. Really just, it's a safe space for you to come and show up as you are, to hopefully feel a little less alone and to know that I see you for who you are as a person inside.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And just to encourage people, if you want to hear more of Eric's story, he shares some more of his story on his podcast. I don't know when release dates and how they'll line up, but at some point you can likely go hear my wife Eileen's story on Eric's podcast as well. And so those are over on his show, Embracing You. And I encourage you to go check those out. Eric, thank you again for being here today. Thank you for sharing your story. I appreciate you.
And thank you as well.
My friends, thank you for tuning in to this episode of A Level Deeper. Thank you for supporting this show. Hey, before you go, I do have one request. That request is simply to share this episode, share the show. If you've been gaining anything from these conversations or something helped shift a perspective or teach you something new, or maybe someone's story helped see yourself in a new way. Maybe there's someone else in your life that you think might benefit from hearing this conversation or one of the other ones on the show. All I ask is for you to share it with them. Send them an email or a text and just say, hey, I think you might like this conversation. That would mean a lot to me. It helps the show grow. It helps these conversations reach more people, which is really the goal here. To tell more stories, share more stories, and shed a little bit more light on this human experience. Anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you for your support. If you want to support the show monetarily, help support me and this independent podcast that I run from my van, there's a link in the show notes to a Buy Me a Coffee link, which is exactly as it sounds. For the price of a single cup of coffee, you can make a donation to the show and help support late night podcast editing sessions and all the work that goes into producing the show on a weekly basis. Anyway, thank you in advance for your support. That link is in the show notes. This is the end of the episode. We'll see you next time.